So today I want to talk about a very interesting topic in tango history. And to be able to properly explain it, I'll first make a comparison with something that seemingly has nothing to do with tango music. Um, Nowadays we live in very stimulating times. So if you're bored, you can you're just a few clicks away from watching Netflix series, watching a movie, endlessly scrolling on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, whatever you have. You can play a video game. You can listen to whatever music you want. Everything's accessible on Spotify. You can take drugs. You can do whatever. Go to a party. Stimulation is everywhere, and that has a lot of impact on our mental state. And one of the things that happens is we cannot really get bored anymore, and some of these things are so stimulating that they're addictive and that they really control people's minds. So when I was 13, I was addicted to a video game, a really stupid video game. So I went to school because I had to, and because it was easy for me to manage it, because I was intelligent enough to just not really do my best and still manage everything. But in my free time, also when I should be doing homework, which is not really free time for a child, right? But I was always playing this stupid game. I was so obsessed with it, and my parents would notice, but they couldn't really do much about it. And at some point, fortunately, I quit that game, and I don't play games. I don't really do any entertainment stuff, but it's up to you what you do with that. I'm just trying to say that it's very stimulating, and it's very hard to be bored nowadays because there's always something going on, always something to kill your time. Um, but the point about this in this video, the real point is that 80 years ago, 90 years ago, 100 years ago, there was not that much to do. I think life was much slower back then. And when you were bored, maybe you would read a book if you had the money for a book. You probably just had to work to survive. And, in your spare time, maybe you would sit with your family or friends and have a chat or go to a cafe, whatever, maybe listen to listen to the radio, for example. That's one thing that certainly appeared at some point for common people also in Argentina to buy. But yeah, it was a very different time. And I want to tell you about something that's maybe a bit, unexpected. But actually, back then, singing tango was seen as cool. It was popular. It was seen as masculine. So everyone wanted to be a tango singer. In the, example of Carlos Gardel. There were also other big examples, obviously, but the first real big example was Gardel. So people wanted to be tango singers. It's also true, like I heard, for example, from Milonguero Pedro Sanchez, I believe it was him who said that also when boys also wanted to dance tango, and it was also a way they practiced with each other so that they could eventually dance with girls, and they could get into contact with girls and be around girls. And that's pretty much something that has inspired men for millennia, for millions of years. But it's probably not the only reason. Like, people were doing this, it was cool to dance, and it was cool to be a singer. So what some of you might not realize is that a lot of the singers that we know and love, for example, from the 40s, they began very young. So I've written down a bunch of examples of when tango singers started to sing with the big orchestras of the 40s. So the main example that I find the most representative is Roberto Rufino with Di Sarli. So he started singing with Di Sarli in 1939 when he was 17 years old. So imagine, tango is all about this heartbreak and all these tough topics. And there's the 17 years old guy who talks about, being dumped or cheating on women, whatever, all these things. So let's just listen to that a little bit here. So this is 17-year-old. And it's hard to imagine a 17-year-old singing about these things, but that's such was the reality of tango music. And what's interesting is that so I've compiled this whole list of names, and they all started more or less around 20 years old. So I have Roberto Rai. He started in 1931, so that's quite early. It's not golden age. With Fresedo, he was 19 years old. Rufino was 17 years old, and they couldn't even often get him into nightclubs because he wasn't 18. And then this guy talks about all these mature, sings about all these mature topics, and becomes extremely popular with people all over the city in Argentina. And then another example, Polesta, who also started pretty much with Di Sarli. He became big with Di Sarli. He was 15 years old when he arrived in Buenos Aires to sing in tango orchestras, and he was 18 years old when he started with at least recording with Di Sarli. But it's also when I read the histories, the biographies on the internet. He already started as a child at parties, private parties, events, and small events like this when he was living outside of Buenos Aires in the province in the west of Argentina. Then you have Raúl Perón, who's also a very typical Golden Age singer. He started at 19 years old with Caló in 1939. But before that, he was already a singer. Juan Carlos Miranda, which is a singer of Temare. He started when he was 19 years old with Temare. Hector Mauré, he started singing more or less at 14, 15 years old when he got interested in singing. He was boxing and he was singing. So these things seem really opposed to each other, but they were seen as an ideal back then among kids, so to say. Like he wasn't 7, but I mean, he's still underage, so you could say he was a child, and he was 20 when he was hired by D'Arienzo. And yeah, Alberto Moran was 18, but he was 22 when he began with Pugliese. And then the last example is well, 2 examples. Alberto Marino, he sang with Troilo as he was 23 years old, but he started singing at 15 years old. And then Alberto Castillo, he began at 20 years old, which is a bit older. And at 25, he was hired by Tanturi. So these are a lot of people more or less around 18 years old, maybe a little bit older, some a bit younger. But the point is that all of these guys did not suddenly start singing when they were hired by big orchestras such as Troilo or Di Sarli. Of course, it would be strange to say like, so let's say you are Di Sarli and you know someone's parents and they have a kid who's 15 years old, and you say, hey, he might be able to sing, and bring him along so for an audition. No, that's not how it worked. That's not how things work. You need to be noticed first. So these guys started as children pretty much at private parties or in very small orchestras, and then they worked their way up, and then they came into the spotlights. And that's something I find extremely interesting, that this tango singing was such a cool thing, that you got all these young guys inspiring to be the new Gardel. So one example, even Gardel himself, he started singing at private parties and in cafés. So nobody knew him, but he started singing. That's how he started his career. So I do have to say that there are also important examples of singers who were not so young when they became famous. For example, or the most successful of their career. For example, Fiorentino with Troilo was older. He was already a bandoneon player earlier. He sang during the 30s, maybe even the late 20s. He was singing in other orchestras. We have recordings of that. It's just a refrain. So it's just a small presence. But he became a big star with Troilo in the 40s. We have people like Maida of Canaro, Roberto Chanel, Alberto Echagüe with D'Arienzo, Ángel Vargas. These people were all older. but yeah, not everyone was so not everyone was a young child, so to say. But what I found from a little research is that, for example, Troilo, in his spare time, he would listen together with his wife to the radio to spot new talent. And new talent, that meant like young guys who were unknown and who could have the potential to become very big stars for the big orchestras. And then you might wonder, like, why? That's the last part of this video. Like, why were they so interested in getting unknown young people in? I think it's because there's a big tension in tango history between tango singers and orchestras. So this is something you might not realize, but for people like Maida, for example, Canaro, Maida, but also Fiorentino, whoever, it was not necessarily their ambition to become Troilo singer. It was their ambition to become a soloist singer and become very famous just with some guitars and your voice. It's all about your voice. It's not about Troilo. It's not about the Starly. It's about your voice. So a lot of guys who were famous in the 30s, for example, they were already older, and they were usually going their own way. A lot of guys, even who were young, they were striving towards becoming soloists. Roberto Rufino left the Sarli to become a soloist. Tanturi was maybe, Castillo, who was a bit less young. He became a very famous soloist. All these guys, they sure loved working with an orchestra, but it seemed like their big ambition was to become really famous in that way. And I've seen some magazines in which they constantly promote new radio stars, young guys that sang as soloists. So that was the ideal, to be like Gardel. So that means not being part of an orchestra for dancers, but being, sure, it was part of the ideal, but the biggest ideal was to be like Gardel, who died already in 1946. They wanted to be like him. So I think these orchestras striving for new talent might have something to do with that. These new stars, they were more easy to control in a way. So they had to first become successful. And one of the ways to become successful is to sing with one of the big orchestras. I think there might also be a reason that some of the guys who were already popular in the 30s, their voices started to decline. Because back then there wasn't a lot known about proper singing, like, you know, health wise. And you can see with guys like Alberto Moran, they sound great in the 40s. Then 8 years later, 10 years later, their voice has already declined so much. So I think it's also a question of a matter of yes, getting singers in when their voice is still so new in a way. So I find this a very interesting topic. And I hope you enjoyed this bit of, well, exploring tango history in a different way than usual. And I'll keep making videos about, yeah, somewhat quirky topics like this.